Good afternoon, everybody. It's Maynard, Mike, and Colin. We're here on 2/22/22 for our fourth Close of Business Tuesday here at Veriton. We are out of our minds excited. We've been studying, reading, thinking, and watching all the news on Russia and Ukraine, just like all of you. But the reason we had to really study it this week is we've got two incredible guests. We've got Dr. Angela Stent, and we've got Dr. Dan Juergen. Dr. Stent has been with us before. We're very lucky to have her. You may know she's a leading specialist on the former Soviet Union, Russia, and relations with the West. She's a senior fellow at Brookings, and she's written a book which foreshadows a lot of what we're going through right now. It's entitled Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. Dan Juergen does not need an introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. He's a great longtime friend of ours, of Veriton and of TPH. He's a recipient of the Golden Pickering Award a couple of years ago. You know him as the vice chairman of IHS Markit, the chairman of CERAWeek, which is coming up March 7th through 11th. Veriton will be a sponsor, so we're excited about that. And Dan is the author of several seminal books on the energy industry, most notably Pulitzer Prize winning The Prize, and more recently, The New Map. And, I think all of us read The New Map for the second time coming into today, and it predicted so much of the struggles we're seeing around resource, how shale changed the game, how the energy transition is changing the game again. So we can't, it is with great enthusiasm and respect for these two that we welcome Angela and Dan.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I look forward to it.
And Maynard, same here. Glad to be back. Thank you.
Okay. Mike, man, lots going on. Holy smoke. Markets, oil, earnings, Iran. I can't believe we're talking about Iran, but why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, Maynard, today it's been a volatile day, as you know. I mean, you had Dow down almost 600 points today. You had crude oil up a couple bucks today. And the way I categorize it today is really kind of a sell the event today in energy, right? I mean, people were saying, why is energy down? We had some CEOs calling us today saying, why is my stock down so much? Well, it's a sell of the event. Everyone is basically thinking this was coming, and that's what's happened. Does that mean that you can't buy these stocks? I'd say, no, just, it's going to be volatile for a while until we get this situation resolved. And so, just kind of looking at some of these slides and just giving you a review of what happened here in the last week and what's going on today. As the energy sector last week kind of sold off. I think people were anticipating this news was coming, and it did sell off again today. Last week crude oil was down a little bit. Today it was up a buck and change. Brent's at around 96, 97, and you have TI about 93. The interesting thing is natural gas was up around 12 or 13% last week. And today you had the European natural gas is up 10 to 12%, obviously on the Ukraine-Russia invasion news. One of the things that we think was interesting and probably just was under the headlines here is two things. The federal oil and gas lease sales have been indefinitely suspended by the Biden administration. And also there was a FERC new pipeline approval process that included a new climate change to it. And I think the thing that we're saying about that is, if we're really worried about high oil and gas prices, why are we proceeding down this road? And these are two things that are concerning. Obviously there's a lot of economic stats coming out. We're not going to really touch that. But also there's a lot of earnings that are going to be happening in the next 2 or 3 days. As you see, the E&Ps, a ton of E&Ps reporting. Obviously, people are going to want to know what return on capital strategies are there. They want to know about OFS inflation. They're going to want to see that capital discipline continues in this $90 to $95 world. Same thing with oil service, a bunch of oil service companies. And this week is really heavy on midstream as well. And so, that's, if we, go to this next slide, the thing that we really want to talk about is what's going on in Iran. This Iranian sanction issue has kind of flown under the radar simply because the Ukraine-Russia situation has been on the front page. And this thing really goes back a decade. If you look at, the P5+1 sanction in 2011 and 2012, that was a decade ago. Iranian production back then was around 4 million barrels a day. It went down to about 2.5 million barrels a day with sanctions. But the interesting thing about it, that didn't, Even then, when oil prices were $100, they didn't go a lot higher. And the reason why is because U.S. production went from 5.5 million barrels to 8 million barrels a day. In 2016, you had this JCPOA agreement. Iran production was a little less than 3 million. It proceeded to go up by about a million change. OPEC spare capacity was about 4 million at that point in time. And U.S. production was around, 9.2 million. A year later, U.S. production was pretty flattish. Iranian production was up 1 million barrels plus. OPEC spare capacity was around 4 million. And prices went up in that time frame. In 2018, this is when Trump put in the Iranian sanctions, pull out the JCPOA. Iranian production was around 3.5 million barrels a day. It went down almost 1.5 million barrels a day in the next year. U.S. production basically was, went from 11 to almost 13 million barrels a day, but crude oil production went up. And now you're seeing right now is Iranian production is around 2.5 million barrels a day. OPEC spare capacity is around 5 million barrels a day, which is pretty high. We think it's going to be less than 3 million barrels a day in the next 6 months. You have U.S. production at 11.5 million. Maybe we grow to 12 million barrels a day, and we have oil prices at 90 to 95. And I think the point is that I think the market is coming to believe that there's going to be, the Iranian sanctions are going to be lifted very, very soon. We're in the final stretches of that. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Could it hit oil prices temporarily? Sure, but I think there's 3 to 4 things going for crude oil price right now. One, the Iranians know that the world needs their barrels. They just do. And the reason the world needs their barrels is because OPEC is underproducing their quotas by about 1 million barrels a day. And finally, the difference this time around versus other times is that U.S. producers have high capital discipline and really returning all their returns to shareholders. So, whereas in the 2011, 2013, 14 period, you were growing 1 million, 1.5 million barrels a day, we're going to probably be growing only 600,000 to 700,000 barrels a day. The market can kind of accommodate those. OPEC is fully in control. So, yeah, we might see prices pull back a bit, but we look at the runway over the next couple of years as being really, really good. Pullbacks, we buy in these names.
Mike, that's awesome. I really can't believe we're talking about Iran in the middle of all this, but so be it.
Crazy.
Last week we talked about getting some more countries into the discussion. So, Colin, I think in addition to China, you were going to hit on global oil stocks and a little bit of what's going on in Russia and a little China. So let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Maynard. With everything that's happening in the world, what we really need is a real-time snapshot of global crude oil flows and stocks. And so here it is. Utilization of the global VLCC fleet is robust. It's now higher than in all but 4 weeks since August of 2020, at about 70% utilization. As recently as September of 2021, that number was 62%. And so obviously a very strong impulse higher here, consistent with about 4% global oil demand growth year over year. That's also what we've got embedded in our 2022 model. It's consistent with the backwardation that we see in the market crude prices. It's consistent with flat prices above $90 for both Brent and WTI. And really, it's just a story of repair in the market. Now, back in May of 2020, this number had been as high as 82%. But remember, at that time, we were using a lot of floating storage. So barrels would go into VLCCs and just sit parked somewhere. This really is much more of a throughput of somewhere in the vicinity of 1.042 billion barrels. And use of VLCCs for floating storage is down about 60% from where it was in that summer of 2020 period. There is one caution. We do see some evidence of price effects. VLCC tanker rates have really begun to deteriorate in the past month. Relative to October of 2021, the West Africa routes are off by about 20%, whether we look to the Gulf Coast or to China, and then also looking at the Arabian Gulf routes to the Med, Singapore, or the Gulf Coast, they're off by about 12 to 16% over the same time period, with most of the decline happening in the last several weeks. So in plain English, it looks like $90 crude is starting to put up a bit of a buyer's strike, and perhaps that effect has been somewhat overwhelmed by the geopolitical risk premium attributable to Russia. Turning to the bottom panels, this would be the global crude oil stocks. Ursa Space Systems is a very high quality geospatial intelligence firm. One of their products is to measure world crude oil tanks from space. They use a satellite-based SAR technology, that's synthetic aperture radar, and essentially in real time, they can monitor 6.6 billion barrels of capacity across 20,000 tanks all over the world, all automated, just an incredible feat of engineering and technology. So the line graph might look simple, but do not be deceived. There is an insane amount of data embedded in this information. And what it tells us is we can observe the very strong build in inventory that accompanied the collapse in demand in the first half of 2020. Across the sample, inventories got to 4.27 billion barrels, but we've now seen about a 440 million barrel draw on net through February 17th of 2022. Notice that we're off the bottom. So again, somewhat consistent with what we're seeing in the tanker rates and also the VLCC numbers, that there appears to be on the margin a little bit of softening, but overall, just an incredibly powerful, bullish story. The demand is there. The inventories are being drawn. They are being moved through oceanic channels and so on. And just one other way of thinking about this, obviously you can take 3.88 divided by 6.6, and you would see the utilization is somewhere in the vicinity of 59% of capacity, which is a low number for utilization of these assets, again, signifying tightness in the market. Another way of thinking about relative tightness is to look at all of the observations over the sample period and to realize as recently as October of 2021, we were at average for this period, the 50th percentile in sample. As of February 17th, we're at 10 percentage points, the 10th percentile. So that's a rate of draw of about 2.4% of relative rank per week for 17 weeks. So again, just a tight market getting tighter. Now, when we look at the individual tanks and then aggregate them up to the regions and then compare one region against the other, we see that inventories this week relative to the same week last year are down by about 200 million barrels. One point that we think is interesting, the inventories in Middle East, North Africa, MENA, are up by about 72 million barrels versus the same week in 2019. Now, that's interesting because it offers a potential explanation for why spare capacity has not been called upon in OPEC as much as might be surmised with a $90 price. The answer is inventories are being drawn down first, and then we'll see what happens with the spare capacity. But as we all know, the official statistics on spare capacity almost certainly overstate actual spare capacity because of the insufficient investment that's gone into those fields. Turning to Russia's financial markets, clear evidence that financial markets have just not liked the invasion of Ukraine at all. In fact, have been very unhappy since October when tensions really began to rise. The ruble cross against the dollar has depreciated by 13%. Russia's sovereign credit default swaps have moved 300% in the wrong direction as measured by basis points against the reference index. And recall that the US is now putting even tighter clamps on debt market access to the Russians. So that number will presumably get even worse, although we would point out Ukraine's numbers have been closer to 900 and above. So there's still some room to narrow that gap. The MOEX, Russia's stock market benchmark, is down by about 20% since its October 2021 high. So a story where equity, debt, and FX all do not like the invasion of Ukraine. Now, we get a very important other statistic when we look at total reserves, including gold held by Russia. That number is now $640 billion as of February 11th, the most recent data point. That's higher than it was back when Crimea was annexed by Russia in February of 2014. It's even higher than where these numbers were in August 2008, after we had just seen $147 oil in the summer of 2008. So Putin is coming from a period of, or a place of exceptional strength, $640 billion that could be drawn down regardless of what happens in these financial markets. And as you can see, these draws in prior periods of crisis could be fairly substantial. but 350 to 375 billion tended to be the trough. And so one could surmise that that's part of the game plan here, that there's room to draw down these reserves by upwards of $300 billion to finance the counter response to whatever the West decides to put on Russia in terms of sanctions. Notice also the Russian holdings of U.S. treasuries are now near zero, $4 billion as of December 21. As recently as March of 2018, that number was 96 billion. Ahead of the Crimea annexation in early 2014, the number was almost 140 billion, dropped by half through April 2015. So this is the de-dollarization strategy that Mr. Putin has talked about since at least 2019. In fact, some references to aspects of it back to 2010. And recall that there is even a bilateral agreement with the Chinese for international settlements of their bilateral trade to be done in yuan and in rubles. And that is increasingly contributing to reserves on either side. Russia's petroleum exports have also been geared significantly towards China in recent years. Back in 2001, China took only 1% of Russia's combined crude oil and product exports. The EU took 61%. By 2014, those figures were 9% and 54%, respectively. In 2020, they were 21% and 43%. And then looking at the Chinese statistics in light of the Russian central bank statistics, it looks like 35% or more of Russia's crude oil exports volumetrically went to China last year. So putting all the pieces together, price risk is obviously substantial, broad, and volatile. It could go in either direction depending on what happens to the supply side or the demand side. A $25 per MMBTU price in the UK gas market has done the job of really slowing the rate of decline in European gas inventories, but they remain vulnerable to any kind of supply outage. ESPO, the crude oil market price for Russia, surpassed $100 for the first time in quite a while today. Dated Brent and WTI are not there yet, but presumably are not too far behind. And then finally, we noticed looking at the ICE April 2022 $90 calls, they settled today at an $8 premium. And that's interesting because those calls expire tomorrow. And so they're not even in the money yet at $8. And it just gives a sense of how nervous markets are about the potential for a price spike overnight. That's it for our snapshot. I'll turn it back to you, Maynard.
Colin, thank you. Great stuff as always. Angela and Dan, we're delighted to have you guys. Since we knew we were going to have you, we've been studying, reading both of your recent books, and of course, like everyone, watching every hour on the hour as things have been changing in the Ukraine. Angela, maybe we could start with you and just talk about, I think we all have a general sense of why we're here, but at the same time, I feel like we all periodically pause and say, wait a minute, why are we doing this? How did this happen? Why now? Do you want to start there and just help us understand why you think we're doing this right now?
Sure. So Putin has been nursing many grudges and grievances, at least for the past 15 years. 15 years ago this week, he gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference, which is where the world's kind of leading defense thinkers and security people gather. And he denounced the United States for imposing its will on the world, for trying to weaken Russia, for not taking Russia's interests seriously. And so that theme has been on his mind for a very long time. And as time has gone on, these grievances have grown. He has now been in power 22 years. He's on his fifth American president, and he's seen these American leaders come and go. He's very jaded, I think, and cynical about them. And so he looked around in the year 2021 and now beginning in year 22, and he saw a US that remains sharply polarized and divided, having trouble dealing with COVID, but the Biden administration having trouble getting its legislative agenda through. He looked at Europe, again, divided, distracted. The Germans have a new government, and it's still finding its feet. The French president is running for re-election. So lots of distractions. And he looked at Ukraine, a country that he has looked upon for a very long time as not being a separate country. In July of last year, he published a 5,000-word article saying that Ukraine and Russia are one people, that they always were, and they need to be united. And so he's had his eyes on Ukraine also for a very long time. And he looked at Ukraine and he saw a president. Remember, the president of Ukraine is a former TV comedian who played a president in a comedy series, who is rather inexperienced and whose popularity was falling. And he thought, this is the time to strike. He also looked at, of course, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so he decided that this was the point where he had had enough. And he really wanted to make the world respond to his claims that Russia is a great power, that it has a right to a sphere of influence. And this was the time, if you like, to relitigate the end of the Cold War, to relitigate the system that had been devised in the 1990s, the security system in Europe, which essentially was to use NATO as the main institution there, and then admit other countries to NATO, and then have a special NATO-Russia relationship. And so for him, it was now time to do something about it. So suddenly in December, we get these two treaties that were presented to the US and NATO, demanding that NATO stop enlarging and basically retreat in its military posture to where it was before it began enlarging in the 1990s. We responded by saying, let's talk. We've had various meetings with the Russians about this. We tried diplomacy, and we kept asking the question, does Putin really mean to negotiate, or is he just using this as a ruse because he wants to take military action? And I think we've now seen the answer.
Well, can I add a couple of things to that, Maynard? I mean, first of all, imagine how Putin is looking at the United States. He has to love it. A significant part of the American people deny the legitimacy of the election of the current president. Wow, that's a great thing for him. And secondly, of course, he's been in isolation.
Two elections in a row, Dad.
2 elections in a row, and he's been part of that, and his bots and his cyber war have been part of that. Secondly, of course, he's been in isolation for 2 years, which is really weird the way he's done it. And isolation, as we know, tends to make people paranoid. The third thing, going back to what you guys were talking about at the beginning, he knows energy markets really well. I mean, people say he's like a CEO when you talk with him about gas markets. And guess what? Coal market is tight, natural gas is tight, and oil is tight. What a great time for somebody who exports coal, natural gas, and oil to move when there doesn't appear to be a lot of flexibility.
So I think, Angela, just to put a finer point on it, and you too, Dan, for all of us watching, I think we've suspected this is how this happened. What we weren't sure is behind the scenes, was NATO or the United States, were we doing anything aggressive that triggered this? It seems like your explanation is he saw weakness. Last week we had a guest who said weakness is provocative. He saw weakness and it was time, and he's been waiting. And like the judo guy he is, Angela, he chose to strike. So that's the right way to think about this?
Yeah, I mean, NATO stopped enlarging to anywhere near Russia in 2004. The only new members since 2004 have been in the Balkans. They've been small countries, and that's really not of a concern to Putin. He claims that the Ukrainians were trying to take back the territories in southeastern Ukraine that were at that point occupied by Russian proxies, although the Russians didn't admit that they had soldiers there. And it is true that just before all this started, the Ukrainians were buying drones from Turkey. Turkey has been a great supporter of Ukraine. And they used one of those drones in this ongoing conflict in which 14,000 people have already died in eastern Ukraine. So one of the things that Putin complained about, again, was that the Ukrainians were taking provocative actions. It is true also that NATO has sent trainers and some equipment and military hardware to Ukraine, but that's in response to what the Russians have been doing. So that every time Putin has escalated, NATO has responded. And so this has been sort of an escalatory cycle. But it is a manufactured crisis. There was nothing that could have triggered that in terms of what either the Ukrainians or NATO was doing.
It seems like if you replay it, and it's easy for us, on the outside looking in to maybe be a little critical, but he's got massive reserves. He's no longer holding U.S. treasuries. He just saw Afghanistan. He knows he's holding a great energy hand with respect to Europe. And then he issued this audacious request, retreat to your 1997 borders and pull all your equipment and people out of Eastern Europe. If you're in the White House, it seems like you should have thought, and I don't mean to be overly critical, but hey, this is real. This is coming. I know when we talked, Dan, a month ago, you had told me you were thinking that we would be where we've gotten to on this. It seems like the administration didn't jump to that conclusion, and they should have.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the administration got very worried in March when they saw this buildup of troops begin. And that's when Biden called Putin and said, let's meet. And they met in June.
Last year.
Of last year, yeah. And after that meeting, and even before it, actually, Russian troops were withdrawing. They agreed that they were going to set up these different working groups on cyber, on strategic stability. And it looked as if the relationship was going to resume. They've been working together on this Iranian nuclear agreement, on some climate issues and things like that. And the problem then was, and so the administration thought that things were going in a more positive direction. And then I guess suddenly in October, they realized that there was this massive troop buildup again. And so they did then respond. They sent the director of the CIA, Bill Burns, former ambassador to Moscow. They sent him to Moscow. He met with Putin and the other top officials, and he said to them, we know what you guys are doing. We can see this. We'd like you to de-escalate. Why are you doing this? And he came back, and then, of course, the escalation went on. Instead of de-escalating, they escalated. So I would say since October, and then, of course, the administration undertook what I think is an unusual and probably reasonably effective strategy of releasing publicly all of this intelligence that it had jointly with the British to our European allies, but to the Russians as well, publicly saying, we know what you're doing. You're massing your troops, you're planning false flag operations, you're planning cyber attacks. There have been cyber attacks. So that was their way of trying to sort of push back and make the Russians realize we are in an information war with Russia, and make the Russians realize we can play, your game too. So I think they've done pretty well with this, given, this tremendous troop buildup.
And one other thing to add, I think, and Angela, you would know this, but I think it was around November when they started talking with the Europeans about sanctions.
Yeah, and they've coordinated, after 4 Trump years when when the Trump administration essentially rejected Europe, denigrated Germany, they've done a good job of, talking to our allies, working on the sanctions. And the fact that today the Germans have now suspended the certification of Nord Stream, I think is a testimony to some of the pressure that was put on them, but also the dialogue they had with the US.
Did you see the Russian official who commented, that's nice you guys canceled Nord Stream 2. I look forward to seeing the prices you're going to pay for your natural gas going forward.
Well, of course, so that's about next year. But one of the big differences here, and one of the things that the Russians hate, is US LNG. About half of the LNG that now arrives in Europe comes from the United States. And as I noted in my piece the other day in the Wall Street Journal, for part of January, the U.S. was actually sending, just the U.S., not LNG in general, was sending more LNG to Europe than Russia was sending through pipelines. So the Russians are in a strong position. But if you look at it in, last year, 2021, they provided 29% of Europe's gas. So there's gas coming from other places as well. It does raise a question about next year and about these inventories of gas that are quite low. But Europe is actually in a better position now than it was when there was a Ukraine gas crisis, not on this level, in 2009, because Europe has made its pipeline system more flexible so it can move gas around. And you didn't have US LNG. It didn't exist then. this is a really big change. This is a real strategic asset that that the U.S. did not have a decade ago.
I'm so glad you mentioned the article that Dan, you're referring to. You wrote it. It was last week. It was Valentine's Day, I think, and it's America takes pole position in oil and gas. And it is an amazing stat that more U.S. LNG was being delivered to Europe than Russian pipe gas. It's a stunning fact.
Not every day, but for quite a number of days.
Yeah, but on that in that time. But I think, Dan, we've gone back. We've been good Dan Jurgens students and reread the new map, and everybody should do that. If you haven't read it, read it for the first time and then read it for the second time, because you foresee so much of what's going on. You talk about the change from energy transition, from shale, how countries are going to they're going to have to rethink their strategic alliances and what matters to them, and how it's going to cause resource conflict. And sure enough, and you point at this scenario that's happening, you really point to it in a way that, like, I wish we'd all been reading it much closer.
You know, I look at it now, and I didn't, obviously Angela's written this great book, Putin's World, which explains his mindset. But as I was writing it, I look back on it now and say, how did I know to sort of focus Russia, Ukraine, natural gas as one of the main stories of the book? I guess there was a sense that you could see where it was going, although one didn't necessarily get to where it is now. But, it all comes together, the shale revolution, Putin's ambitions. And of course, I have the story in the book where Putin, and I mentioned in the article, where Putin started screaming at me, shouting at me in 2013 at an economic conference in St. Petersburg. There he is on the stage with Chancellor Merkel, and there's ice between them. They clearly don't like each other. And so they say to me, you can ask the first question. So my first question is, Mr. President, and this is the question you could have asked Putin any years for the last 20 years, what are you going to do about diversifying your economy from its heavy dependence on oil and gas? By accident, I mentioned the word shale. He interrupts me. He starts shouting at me. He says, shale is terrible. It's awful. It destroys the world. It has to be stopped. And I'll tell you, in front of 3,000 people being shouted at by Vladimir Putin, not a pleasant experience. But afterwards, I thought, why did he do that? One, he saw that US LNG would eventually compete with Russian gas in Europe, and that's exactly what's happening today. And number two, he saw that it would augment the influence of the United States in the world. And I've seen it in India, I've seen it in Japan, Korea. And, he saw it in 2013. I have to say that some people are only discovering that truth in Washington, D.C. in 2022.
Angela, you had a recent article in Foreign Affairs, and you also had in the last page of your book, or the last chapter of your book, you had the 7 pillars of Putin's world. And I thought these were great and worth just sharing with our audience. But fundamentally, it's Russia's got a right to be at the table. Their interests are just as legitimate as the West. They should have a sphere of influence. There's this notion that some countries are more sovereign than others. That Russia is not going to be a disruptive influence like Putin views the West as being. And, Russia believes that a fractured Western alliance is in its interest. And Russia believes in the return to a world order which was spheres of influence based, which, as far as I can tell, means Russia gets to do its thing, China gets to do its thing, and the U.S. can do its thing, but kind of only in the Western Hemisphere or something like that. Could you talk to us about how Putin thinks? This all really honestly makes sense if you think about a guy who he was in East Germany when the wall came down. He's passionate about his nation. I don't mean to defend him, but he honestly doesn't. Is he overly complex, or is he honestly pretty straightforward?
Well, because he's a former KGB case officer and he's running a state in which people from the intelligence services predominate in a way, by the way, that they never did during the Soviet era. it's a very opaque system, right? They deliberately obscure everything. In the 1990s and during the Yeltsin years, everyone was on their cell phones. We had a pretty good idea about what was going on there. Since you have Putin and his fellow intelligence service people in power, we don't have a good view into it. So he may be less complex than we realize. And I think, by the way, what I would add now to those 7 pillars is, on the one hand, he wants a world order divided into 3 spheres of influence. That might be what he wants. On the other hand, it's possible now, if we see what he's doing in Europe, that he wants just a Hobbesian disruptive world order where there are no rules of the game. I mean, if you go back to the Yalta system, which he praises, the United States and the Soviet Union had divided the world more or less into 2, and they respected each other's spheres of influence. But I think what he now envisages is something where there just are no rules and everyone is kept off balance, just as now we're reacting to everything that he's doing. So he does have the mentality of someone who comes from the intelligence services. It was traumatic for him in his late 30s when he was a mid-ranking KGB case officer in East Germany, in a provincial East German town when the wall came down. He had missed all the Gorbachev years of kind of more freedom of expression and questioning things because he was in East Germany. The mob banged on the door of the KGB headquarters and they wanted to see their files. And so Putin stayed up all night with his colleagues, burning them. And then the furnace exploded. So he tells that story in a sort of series of interviews he gave to journalists when he first became president. But it's also true that even though he called, so for him it was personal, the end of communism in East Germany, the end of communism, the end of the Soviet Union, because he had devoted that part of his life to serving its intelligence services. But of course, if the Soviet Union wouldn't have collapsed, he might have remained a kind of middle-level KGB case officer in some small German town or somewhere else. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, he got to become eventually Russian president and a very wealthy man. So, but apparently that hasn't changed his view of what is due to him politically.
Well, so the collapse was oddly good for his career, I guess you might say. But
Maynard, I'll just jump in. I think you could say no one has done better out of the collapse of the Soviet Union than Vladimir Putin, who, as Angela says, spends all this time mourning its collapse.
Right.
I guess what you tend to look at it, particularly after reading your book, Angela, is so here was a guy who's just he's upset about the collapse. You know, he's power. He's drawn to more and more power. He's got a classic view of the world. He's got all that KGB thinking. He just looks like a former Soviet who's intent on rebuilding the empire, and he's aggressive, and he doesn't play by the rules. So if you know you have a guy like that, you just sort of replay the tape and wish maybe we just should have sanctioned him in December. Like when it was clear, like you have a bad boy on your hands. If this was a zoo, he's a tiger. I don't know. Again, maybe it's easy for us to be critical, but we don't have a lot of mysteries here about what kind of guy we're dealing with.
Well, I think the only thing that really would affect him would be, you know, really strong personal sanctions against his wealth and against his family and people around him. We know that he was furious when the Panama Papers were published. And it was disclosed that his lifelong childhood friend, who's a cellist, happened to have a bank account with $2 billion in it in Panama, you know, which is nice work for someone who's a cellist. And, you know, so exposing friends of his who were, you know, depositing his money for him, one assumes that really got him. And that's, by the way, when he apparently gave the order for the, you know, for the Russian internet cyber criminals to go and hack into the Democratic Party's National Committee's emails, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one thing I think that would get him, but nobody has actually done that yet. But I think that some of those kinds of sanctions are being contemplated if there's a full-scale war.
But, and I think, Maynard, I guess there's a question which will be tested, because you have to, let's say on sanctions, carve out oil and gas, because of course Europe depends upon it. uh, it will be a test to see how even massive retaliation sanctions, the degree to which they change him, or has Putin sort of seen them coming and made Russia sanction proof?
So maybe that's one place we could go now a little bit is imagine we're all at the table with Putin and trying to negotiate our way out of this. Do you think, is there a chance here to get everything on the table, like his cyber warfare against everyone? He's active, he's causing trouble all around the planet. Is there some sort of grand bargain we can make with him to let Ukraine be a standalone neutral state, and we won't press the agenda more, but we can get a lot of things? What is the negotiated deal other than the outrageous one he put on the table? Is there a deal we could do here to get out of this mess?
Well, we've offered him in the responses to the treaties, we've offered quite a few things which do go to the heart of some of the Russian security concerns. We've offered to talk about the missile defense deployments in Romania and Poland that the Russians complain about. We've offered to talk about troop deployments in general. We've offered to maybe revive the treaty on intermediate range nuclear weapons that the Trump administration pulled out of and then the Russians did. So there are a number of confidence building areas which we have offered to sit down and talk to the Russians about. But they keep coming back and saying, this is inadequate. Tony Blinken was supposed to meet with Sergei Lavrov, the two foreign ministers, in somewhere in Europe on Thursday, and he's just canceled that trip because at the moment there's really nothing to negotiate about, even though Lavrov yesterday in the strange cabinet meeting that was televised said that we could still go on negotiating. So there are things we can negotiate with the Russians. But we cannot meet their maximum demands there, which they seem to be inflexible on. And so, one does come to the conclusion that Putin may have, given us these treaties and floated these trial balloons as a way of, forcing us to respond to his agenda, but maybe he never intended to come to any agreement with us because he knew that their maximum demands are unacceptable. So, we do have ongoing talks with the Russians about ransomware and cyber. We do have ongoing talks with them about strategic stability and a number of other issues. But I'm not sure this will satisfy Putin now because he really wants Russia to control Ukraine, to control its government, to have a government that's pro-Russian. It's beyond just saying Ukraine, there's a moratorium on Ukraine joining NATO. So at the moment, I don't see a diplomatic way forward because he doesn't appear to be in the mood for it. And I think the Biden administration doesn't see any path forward at the moment either.
Angela, do the Russian people support this? I mean, at some level, they like a tough guy, but I mean, all this death and destruction and cost and economic pain, and do you think the Russian people really, is this causing his popularity to increase? Does he think about that? What's that like?
So a majority of Russians believe that the crisis is caused by the US and NATO, because that, for those people who watch, state-run electronic media, that's what they're fed every day. But public opinion data indicates that a majority of Russians do not want to fight a war with Ukraine. I mean, many Russians have Ukrainians in their family. I mean, there are a lot of mixed families. If you watch all the Russian media in the past few weeks, they have not been preparing the people for a war with Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea was very popular. But Putin's popularity rate has actually gone up in the past 2 weeks from 60 to 68%, which is, it used to was 80% at the height after Crimea. But still, the idea, if you tell your population that the Ukrainians are your brothers and sisters, and then you're going to have body bags coming back, thousands of people if there were a major invasion, that's not going to be good for stability or his popularity in Russia. And you have had some former generals of quite high ranking come out and publicly come out against this and say a major war, taking Kiev would be folly. So he may be considering that. And that's why what we may see is this kind of incremental, steps that they've recognized the independence of these two entities. They've sent so-called peacekeepers there. They may try to take control of the entire of these two entities because, in fact, the Ukrainians control parts of both of those so-called republics. And they might slowly just try and grind Ukraine down and wait for the alliance to have, to look elsewhere, to have other things that preoccupy it. And that might be a more likely scenario than an all-out war, which, whose consequences we don't know. And I would just point out that, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, and therefore NATO isn't going to defend Ukraine, but Poland is. And you can imagine scenarios where if there's major conflict in Ukraine, that somehow there's a cyber attack that affects Poland. There are some Russian soldiers who, by mistake or whatever, that there's some kinetic shooting between Russians and Poles, and then you get the NATO alliance and the Article 5 collective defense in play, and then who knows what happens.
And of course, I mean, there's a lot. Nobody's completely in control of events. So if if the Russian army takes a part of those areas that is controlled by the Ukrainian and shelling begins, then that could also be a pretext that Putin wants to have happen to sort of create a provocation to that. And he would say it was a provocation by the Ukrainians, and therefore, so it looks like it's possible that I don't know if Angela's suggestion is he can go in a couple of different directions here.
So Dan, one thing I think, we all tend to, of course, see things, through the lens that we've adopted, but all of this looks like an indictment of how we have been proceeding globally around energy, right? It looks like we've walked into this. Germany pulled away from nuclear. Europe, they did make some good decisions, but they made some other poor decisions. The U.S. has started pushing, an agenda, which I don't know how Putin looks at our energy transition agenda and interprets that. But the whole thing looks like there should be a major course correction in the energy transition as a result of not just this, but some other things. Is that what you feel is coming when you talk to leaders? Are you feeling that they understand or that they think that way?
Well, I think that, remember, even before this crisis, there was already an energy crisis in Europe.
Yeah.
Natural gas prices, 4 or even 10 times higher than normal. And I think when that happened, it's persisted, by the way. So it is and I think it was happening at the same time as the Glasgow Climate Conference. And it was like, oh, this is happening over there and that's happening over there. But I think there needs to be, what makes you think that an energy transition is going to go smoothly as a PowerPoint suggests it will? And then on top of that, I think we've seen what we can call amnesia about the importance of energy security and energy reliability. And that amnesia is kind of being brought to an end by what's happening now. So I think you have to look at the whole system and not just at the part of it that you really like. I mean, wind and solar are great. Costs have come down. They're going to grow very rapidly, but they don't do the whole system. And this belief, the world still runs about 80% on hydrocarbons, and it's not going to come down that quickly. So energy security is back on the agenda.
Well, I guess maybe picking up that baton, one thing that we've seen markets kind of ask about is what's happening with Iran and Venezuela and the potential for supply to come back. And we noticed, looking at a Reuters article this morning, the irony that it was a Russian envoy who announced that the JCPOA may be nearing, some sort of, conclusion of those talks that Angela mentioned. So I guess the question is, as all of the chess pieces are moving around Europe, how do you both see the potential for supply to come back from Venezuela or Iran? Or another question we hear people asking in the marketplace, does China use what's happening in Europe in a great game style ploy for Taiwan? And I realize it's a lot to ask, but those are two of the big questions.
Well, let me take part of that. It's kind of ironic that at the same time we're putting sanctions on Russia, we may be taking them off Iran. And if we do, that would bring maybe a million barrels a day or a little more than that into the market. And that would be an offset, and it would have an impact on a price that otherwise is going to be driven up by, among other things, by the sanctions themselves, because the payment system, banks will want to overcomply so they don't get stuck with $1 billion fine or a $5 billion fine. So that would be a moderating. I think Venezuela's come back, but I did see the other day that Iran was sending oil to Venezuela so that they could run it with their heavy oil system. I think that the country that's said to have the largest oil reserves in the world, at one point was producing less oil than North Dakota. So I think Venezuela, I don't take that as a serious factor. I think it's more interesting to see what's happening in Guyana and other places where new supplies come in. Iran would have an impact on. It's a question, and Angela can talk about China's reaction to what's happening in Ukraine, which is mixed. But I think this would not be the moment they would want to take Taiwan. But boy, we're almost in a different world, but we'd really be in a different world. But Angela, do you want to pick up on China and Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting. So when Putin met with Xi Jinping at the beginning of the Olympic Games, and they signed this 18-page declaration of friendship, and the Chinese endorsed the Russian claims that NATO should stop expanding and it should withdraw to the 1997 posture, and that Russia's security needs should be met. But the word Ukraine didn't appear in that 18-page communique because China has a growing economic relationship with Ukraine. Ukraine is part of the Belt and Road. They want more business there. Their political relations are fine. The Chinese congratulated the Ukrainians on the anniversary of their independence recently, at the end of last year. And so there was a question mark. And then at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, the Chinese foreign minister, who participated remotely, gave a speech in which he said the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries needs to be respected, and that includes Ukraine. I gather that in the Security Council debate, the Chinese have just said, that there has to be a way out of this. So I find it very hard to imagine that the Chinese will in any way endorse what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. I believe there's a General Assembly discussion tomorrow. Maybe the Chinese will do what they did in 2014 and they'll abstain from any vote. But my understanding is that the Chinese see Taiwan and Ukraine very differently because they believe that Taiwan is part of China. They have their own timetable for doing this, but Ukraine isn't. It's a sovereign, different country from Russia, and Russia shouldn't be doing that because the Chinese often stress sovereignty and territorial integrity. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. I think the Chinese are still figuring out exactly how to respond to this.
Yeah, Dan, just kind of piggyback on the Iranian sanction issue is, the question we have is that, if Iran comes back in, the sanctions are lifted, it would seem to be that they're going to be outside the OPEC plus quota system, at least initially. How do you think that, affects the cohesion in the group? And the second question is, Russia is obviously part of the OPEC plus group. I mean, what is their, benefit to have Iran coming back onto the market?
Well, I don't know. Maybe that part of the question I'll leave to Angela, actually, except that maybe they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But I think on the, Iran, I think, if you notice, and of course and many of the people watching this will know that that the OPEC Plus is supposed to bring 400,000 barrels a month back, but it hasn't been able to do that because a number of countries simply have not made the investment and the maintenance, and they can't get back to their old capacity. So they're bringing less back. So a million barrels a day, depending on the timing, I think the market, it would, in other circumstances, might really lead to price. I think it would stabilize the price maybe, and bring it down. But it would not be, it's not like, it's going to be 3 million barrels a day. And you still have, once the sanctions go in place, all the questions about the payment system and everything, because Russia exports 6 or 7 million barrels a day. And are people going to be able to pay for it? We understand, IHS Markit, that already people are trying to diversify, getting oil into storage, that already it's prefigured that in the response. So as to why the Russians want to have a nuclear agreement with Iran, I turn that back to Angela.
Well, I mean, I think that the Russians, they care sincerely about non-proliferation, and they really don't want the Iranians to have nuclear weapons. Even though, they may be competitors on the oil market, and they also want to be kind of a guarantor. Russia has gone back into the Middle East since 2015 when it, began to support President Assad in the civil war. And so this is part of its more overall, being a major player in the Middle East, having leverage with all sides in all disputes, be they the Iranians, the Saudis, the Israelis. And so this is part of their overall diplomacy. And they would prefer that the Iranians not have nuclear weapons, because that would also disturb, the balance of the Middle East, where Russia is a major player.
So, Angela, one question just in the mind of our friend, Mr. Putin. So everybody's sizing up everybody else. Everybody's trying to read each other. If you're Putin and the United States is in the middle of this crisis, continuing to negotiate this situation with Iran, looking to bring it to a conclusion, I guess, does that strike you as weak? It seems like the United States should say, we're not talking to any bad people anymore. Like the United States should be, I don't know, that just doesn't have the tough guy image that we seem to need right now. Or am I just reading that really immaturely?
Even during the Cold War, when we had, bad relations with the Soviet Union, we still negotiated arms control and other deals with them. I mean, I think, from Russia's point of view, it wants this deal restored. It's actually playing a helpful role for the US. And so maybe it thinks that this in some way will mitigate some of the other things that the United States might do. It'll be interesting to see whether it does, but I don't think that would have a major impact on the way that the Kremlin sees the United States.
Interesting. Well, you guys have been fantastic with your time. We know that every organization on the planet has been looking to visit with both of you. And so for us to get both of you at the same time is wonderful. Maybe we could just kind of close with a couple of questions, because we keep asking around here, what does the world look like in 10 years? And that's an energy question. What does the energy world look like in 10 years? Maybe, Angela, I know in your book you had a great quote. You said, Putin solved his succession problem by choosing Putin. What does Russia, on this current path, what does Russia look like in 10 years? Is there hope? Is it more of the same, or how do you think about Russia's future?
Well, I think if Putin's still in power in 10 years, it's unlikely that he's going to suddenly change and decide that maybe he should be partners with the West and we could work together. I think he's sufficiently disillusioned and he has too many grievances. And so the question is, if you have then a hostile relationship with the United States and Europe, but you have, closer ties with China, India, a number of other major countries, the Russians are, going back into Africa, Latin America, Russia can still itself have a major global role. But what about domestically? If they don't move away from a hydrocarbon-based economy, then they don't really create the institutions of a modern state, then they sink further behind, not only China, but many of their neighbors. They have a demographic problem. Their population is declining. And the segment of their population that's growing is the Muslim population. So the demographic balance in Russia will have changed again in 10 years. If there are no meaningful reforms, and if the economy isn't really modern, they can limp along, then you have, I understand the transition away from hydrocarbons will take a long time. And so people will still be buying their oil and gas then. So that's one scenario. Now, if Putin decides for some reason to have a managed transition, and that's very tricky in any authoritarian country because you want to retain your liberty and your assets. But if you were to decide to do that and you had a younger person come in, none of this looks very likely now, but somebody from the technocratic elite, someone like the prime minister whom he now has, I'm not saying he would be Mr. Mishustin, they might have a different vision for Russia, and they might understand that it's better economically for Russia and to have less adversarial relations with the West and to rethink some of those priorities. So Russia could look somewhat different. But as long as Putin's in the Kremlin and is surrounded by these people from the intelligence services who share his worldview, I don't see that much changing in 10 years. But then, as I say in my book, Putin likes to surprise, and Russia often surprises. And for those of us who are in this business, we're often taken, by surprise when things happen that we didn't predict. So there's always that possibility.
So let me add a footnote to that. In 10 years, Putin will be about the age of Biden. And he certainly projects the image that he's a vigorous jock, although he did look, when he gave his speech last night, his hour-long diatribe, he did not look as vital as he has in the past. But
Dan, and I hate to jump in, Dan, but we're going to put a couple of pictures up. One, this is of Putin playing hockey. And we've got another one of Putin in his judo outfit. So this is a unique animal. We'll put those up just to emphasize your point. But yes, sir. Putin in power in 10 years. It reminds me, as my mother aged, there was a gerontologist who took care of her. And the gerontologist, I remember she said one thing. She said, the first thing they teach you in gerontology, as you get older, you become more like yourself. So think of Putin as he is today and what he'd be like in 10 years. But on to the pictures. I think that's why we might need to find a transition candidate for him. Dan, maybe as we wrap up, can we try the same thing in energy? So Angela took 10 years ahead in Russia. As you think about 10 years ahead in energy, what would you say are some key features?
I think, and this is, a conclusion I came to writing the new map, that oil and gas will continue to be very significant. We'll have an energy mix. They'll be part of it. It will be a somewhat different mix. 10 years is a pretty short time in energy because it involves so much engineering, which I think some people don't understand. But we'll know a lot more about the role of hydrogen. We'll know a lot more about carbon capture. And going back to Angela's surprise, there'll be some technological surprise. I know that at Veriton, you're going to be looking for what those next surprises are going to be, and you'll try and see them and may well see them earlier than other people. The only thing I would say about surprises in the energy business, they kind of gestate for about 20 years or 25 years before they burst on the scene. And that was true of shale. Solar and wind were 50-year-old industries, and it was only in the last 10 years that they really took off. And even think about your Moderna or your Pfizer shot. It seems, they did them in 9 months. Well, it's actually 30 years of research to get there. So there are probably things going on today that fit what Angela's saying, surprise. I know this is going to be on Veriton's agenda, but I do think it'll be a different energy mix. And I think if you try and push the energy transition too fast, you're going to have what we're seeing before this crisis. You'll see disruptions, and then you will see some backlash.
Well, that's a great place to end. We as we wrap up here, everybody should go read the new map. You should read Putin's World. Angela, spasibo большое, and Dan, huge thank you. We really appreciate having you guys, and look forward to seeing you at Zero Week. Dan, anything you want to add on Zero Week before we drop away?
Zero Week's going to be great. It's going to be quite amazing. We'll all learn a lot about it people are really looking forward to actually being in person. We haven't done it in person for 3 years. So it's going to be a great event. And I think it will give us some very clear windows into the future. But let me congratulate Veritain on this series that you're doing and how you're educating and informing every week more and more people, and certainly very pleased to be part of it, and wish you the best as Veritain continues to develop.
Thank you so much. Thank you.